Well, evening folks, thanks to everyone for turning out. The last time I was here was almost exactly a year ago, and it was downstairs in the middle of that heat wave that we had. So it was something like being in a furnace in the middle of the Sahara Desert on the hottest day of the year. I remember it well. So it's much more comfortable today, I'm very glad to say. This talk is titled Occult Aspects of the Beatles and the McCartney Conspiracy, and it's going to be in effectively 3 parts. I've got with me today a good friend of mine, Matt Sergiou, who is the proprietor of a couple of blog sites. One is called Conspiro Media, and the other one is simply called Occult Beatles. And he is an absolute authority on all matters Beatles. He's very humble, and he'll tell you that he's not, but he's got a very encyclopedic knowledge of all these things, which far surpasses mine. So I've recruited him today to step in and do part of this presentation with me. So I'll be doing part 1 myself, introducing the whole thing, then we'll bring in Matt, then we'll have a bit of a break, and then we're back for part 2, which is all about Paul McCartney. Which one? In terms of the timings, we'll just see how it goes. We'll free flow with the universe because we're in Bristol, right? And that's what people do here. So, the title, Occult Aspects of the Beatles. This presentation poses the question, were the Beatles really 4 regular working class lads from Liverpool who just happened to put together a band, come up with a few good guitar riffs, write a few catchy songs, get a record deal, and then, against all the odds, become the most influential and prolific band of all time? Does that sort of process happen under a group's own steam, on a grassroots organic level, or can this process only occur at the hands of the organisations that make these kinds of careers happen? So that's the question I'll be posing. It will probably be fairly clear how I feel about it as we go on, but we'll be looking at some of the evidence and much of the symbolism that pertains to the Beatles not having been an organic creation, but having been placed into the position which they were. They certainly are the most fascinating group to get into and to analyse, and you could make a full-time career out of just looking at the Beatles' music and their imagery and all the ancillary activities of the 4 members. There's no other group that you can apply this degree of scrutiny to, I feel. You can certainly go in on the Rolling Stones for several days, and there's no shortage of sordid and nefarious stuff to discover there, but no one ever really comes close to the Beatles. And I really don't feel that in 50 years' time we're all going to be sitting here looking back on One Direction or Justin Bieber and analysing their lyrics and their symbolism in the same way that people still are the Beatles 50 years on. So they really are a fascinating act to study. A good place to start would be with the very naming of the group itself then. And they went through different guises before they finally settled on the Beatles with the A in the spelling. So John Lennon first called his group the Blackjacks before it morphed into the Quarrymen. And then it was also known as Johnny and the Moondogs, the Nurk Twins for just 2 days, the Beatles spelt in this very interesting way with 2 A's, then the Silver Beatles, the Silver Beats, back to the Silver Beatles with an A before eventually surviving as the Beatles. That's an excerpt from my first book there. John Lennon in interviews gave these very cryptic, ambiguous comments regarding where the name came from, and famously he said, "It came in a vision, a man appeared on a flaming pie and said unto them, from this day forward you are Beatles with an A." I suspect that is an element of masterful speaking going on here, where he appears to be saying one thing, but when you look beneath the surface narrative, there's other things being communicated in his words, and there'll be some more examples of this as we go on. The Beatles had many connections through to the notorious Victorian era British occultist Aleister Crowley, who crops up time and time again in the story of the corporate music industry. So many acts through the ages have expressed a reverence and a fascination to the occult works of Aleister Crowley. And one of the books that he put out was titled The Winged Beatle. Very interesting that we have the names of 2 acts that Paul McCartney was involved with, encoded in the title of this work, Wings and the Beatles. In terms of the Beatle aspect of it itself, there is a particular breed of beetle, the scarab beetle, which was very important to ancient Egyptian mythology, ancient Egyptian civilizations. And these cultures would revere this particular creature because of its habit of rolling its dung into a ball, such as we see here, and rolling it across the landscape. And for the Egyptians, this symbolized the sun being rolled across the sky each day, from sunrise to the zenith of the sun, going all the way through to the setting of the sun at the end of the day. This process was symbolized through the habits of this particular creature, and so they came to revere this scarab beetle in their civilizations, and we see many inscriptions of this in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and other carvings. I've put this in just as a curiosity while we're talking about these scarab beetles. This is a coat of arms that was drawn up for George Martin, the longtime Beatles producer, known very often as the fifth Beatle, due to his hugely influential role in the group. And you notice something very interesting here. This was drawn in, I think it was a couple of decades ago, maybe in the 90s sometime. It's not a family coat of arms that goes back generations. It's one that was drawn up more recently. And in it, we see 3 of these scarab beetles of Egyptian mythology in the shield in the center of the coat of arms there. Interesting that there are 3 and not 4. As I say, it's just an added curiosity. We're going back now to the childhood of John Lennon and the area of Liverpool in which he grew up. This is the road in which the house where he grew up with his Aunt Mimi famously was situated, in Woolton, Liverpool. It was known as Menlove Avenue, which in itself is a name to conjure with, right? So then we look at some of the other places that were in the immediate vicinity of where Lennon grew up. We have Strawberry Field here, the original Strawberry Field on which the song was based. And this was a children's home, very close to the Lennon house in Woolton. And evidently the young childhood Lennon used to go down to this area and play and was captivated and fascinated by it. We have Strawberry Fields in Central Park, New York. This is the tribute to John Lennon in that city, very close to the Dakota building where he was assassinated. And so this is the American version of Strawberry Fields, but that was the original one back there in Liverpool. This is a map of the area of Woolton. We see Menlove Avenue going down the centre of the map there. It's probably a bit difficult to make out some of these place names because of the brightness of the image, but we can see some of the road names include Druidsville Road, Quarry Street, and there's Yew Tree Road, Calder Grange, and another reference to Druids in one of these road names as well. There was a video put out by Thomas Sheridan, the researcher, a while back, where he drew attention to some of the interesting road names in the vicinity where the young Lennon grew up, including Druids Cross Road and Druidsville Road. And he makes the observation in this video that all of this must have directly impacted upon the young Lennon as he played in the ancient strawberry fields which had remained intact for centuries. The field would have retained the same mystical animism within its environment from pre-Christian times. So he's making the point that Lennon would have soaked up some of the atmosphere and the mystic kind of nature of the area in which he grew up, and this was later channeled through some of the Beatles' more experimental music. These childhood experiences would have been released from his subconscious as Lennon began to explore Hinduism and other spiritual paths during the writing and recording of Strawberry Fields Forever, as the Beatles entered into their second phase, when they'd shed the original boy band image and all these love songs that they started out doing, and they embarked on their psychedelic, more experimental phase towards the end of the 60s. This is John Lennon's old man, Freddie Lennon, who was a sailor, and he spent much of his time away at sea during John Lennon's childhood. He was also an amateur musician himself and a singer, and he put out this single which was called That's My Life. It's misspelt here as That's My Life, but it's supposed to be life. And we get a very interesting design on the sleeve to this single, which is black and white checkerboard duality of the type that you see on the floor in Masonic temples. It's not the first nor the last time that we encounter black and white checkerboard flooring when it comes to symbolism related to the corporate music industry. But this is John Lennon's old man, and there's sometimes a piece of audio there which I play to people because Freddie Lennon sounded uncannily like John in terms of his singing voice. And in some of my talks I play a little piece of music, but it's evidently not here, so we won't worry about it. This is the original lineup of the Beatles. Very young lads. We have John Lennon, we've got George Harrison going from left to right. In the centre there, you've got the original drummer, Pete Best, pre-Ringo days. Then you've got Paul McCartney, we'll worry about which one later. And you've got the original bassist on the right-hand side there, Stuart Sutcliffe, who was in the group in its very earliest incarnation. So Pete Best was the original drummer, and his mother, Mona Best, owned a venue in Liverpool known as the Casbah Coffee Club. And this was one of the places where the Beatles got their very early gigs in their pre-fame days. There is a story involving Neil Aspinall, who is a long-time Beatles roadie and associate that used to go out to gigs with them and was a very trusted confidant of the Beatles in their inner circle for many years. He lodged with Pete Best in those very early days, and during the time that he stayed in Pete Best's mother's house, he just happened to impregnate her. And she ended up giving birth to a son known as Rogue Best. So we had this very interesting situation where you've got Neil living with Pete and they're roughly the same age, but he's now got a son with Pete's mother. Awkward. And quite soon after that, Pete is kicked out of the band and he gets to be replaced by Ringo. So whether this event had any bearing on Pete being kicked out of the band, we can only speculate. We also hear that Pete was quite a good-looking lad back in the day, and he used to attract the attention of young females. And John and Paul were apparently a little bit perturbed by the fact that Pete was getting all this attention from the ladies, so they replaced him with Ringo. Problem solved. There you go. So this is Stu Sutcliffe in a very early promotional picture. Stuart came from a Scottish family, and it would appear that the family was steeped in Freemasonry and had a history in that fraternity. So here he is striking a very interesting pose. He's making this triangle of manifestation with his fingers and thumbs, and he's holding it roughly above his sacrum, the sacrum chakra. And so this is a symbol which is used within Freemasonry and other occult secret societies. And the triangle of manifestation is where you apply your will or your intent to a situation that you wish to bring about into physical manifestation. And you put that energy into it, and you're supposed to be able to bring about your wishes through applying this symbol. So here's Stuart striking this particular pose, which is not something you'd really do by accident, I feel. Your hands wouldn't naturally go into that kind of pose just as you're sitting there. So it would appear to be deliberately posed. Here's Anton LaVey, the High Priest of the Church of Satan, which was formed in 1966, giving us the same symbol, the triangle of manifestation. He's holding this one above his eye and applying his energy that way. But either way, the idea is the same. Here's another one of Stuart Sutcliffe behind an interesting iron gate design arrangement. And you'll see that the spirals of the gate are arranged into 3 sixes if you look at them the right way. This, I would suggest, is again no accidental pose. He didn't just happen to be stood behind a gate and a photographer snapped him there and then. This was a deliberate pose, and it's a way of communicating what it is he's associated with through the symbolism. This is very far from an isolated example. Through the ages, through the decades, we see this type of symbolism cropping up time and time again with A-list household name artists. Stuart didn't last very long. He died in 1962 at the age of 21 of a reported brain aneurysm. And this was during the days when the Beatles were performing in Hamburg, those very grueling early gigs that they did. Reportedly, Stuart got into a fight involving some of the crowd, and the whole of the group were involved, and he took a few punches and hits, and this, we're told, is what led to his brain aneurysm, which killed him at the age of 21. And then Paul McCartney became the bassist of the Beatles, taking up the role that was vacated by Stuart. According to this guy, Dr. John Coleman, who put out this very well-known book in 1991 called Conspirators' Hierarchy, The Story of the Committee of 300. This is one of the must-have books within conspiracy research and conspiracy culture, where he breaks down the structure of organised society in terms of who's really running the show. And he states that there is this committee of 300 individuals allied to various networks and groups, and they basically dictate and control every aspect of human life. They are affiliated with military intelligence operations such as MI5 and MI6 in Britain, and also an organisation known as the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations based in London. This is a think tank organisation which concerns itself with social engineering and mass mind control. And the idea is that they entrain the public in terms of how to think. They sow values and belief systems into the minds of the general public without anyone being aware that it's going on. And oftentimes this is achieved through entertainment and popular culture. So Coleman's claim in this book was that the Beatles were a product of the Tavistock Institute and that they were created to have a controlling effect on the emerging counterculture society of the 1960s. Unfortunately, he doesn't offer any documentation to back up his claims. He just comes out and makes the statements. So it's very difficult to verify what he says. Although, from the research that I've done into how culture creation works and social engineering, it wouldn't surprise me if the Beatles had been affiliated with the Tavistock Institute. Unfortunately, I don't have any documentation to hand to prove that is the case, so it remains within the realms of speculation. Anyway, in the book, Coleman claims that there was this guy known as Theodor Adorno who was connected to the Frankfurt School in Germany. And the Frankfurt School is very closely connected to the Tavistock Institute. It's involved in similar activities. And so Coleman states that Adorno was well known to Tavistock. He was known as the Karl Marx of music. He called his sound corrosive and unacceptable, and it was based on a 12 atonal system consisting of heavy, repetitive sounds. So Coleman was clearly no fan of pop music, and he made no bones about it. He frowned very much on the Beatles' output and all the other pop groups that emerged in the 1960s, and he felt that they were there to debase and degrade culture. And I certainly feel there was an aspect of that going on towards the end of the 1960s, when we had the whole counterculture and all the LSD coming in and the psychedelic era. But this is Coleman's opinion on the whole thing. I'll skip through this because it's a bit wordy. Let's get into some of this symbolism, and Matt is going to take this further with some of his slides a little bit later on. So we have one of the Beatles' early albums with the Beatles, and you can see that the group have half of their faces in shadow, creating some interesting ideas. Maybe they're getting in touch with their shadow sides. Maybe we're supposed to focus on the one eye which is being illuminated while the other one is being kept in the shadows. There's all kinds of symbolism at play here, tying into, again, Freemasonry and other secret society occult traditions. The Beatles' 65 album has the group sitting underneath umbrellas, which becomes interesting. I think I've got a breakdown of the word umbrella here in the Latin, the etymology. Umbra, from which it's derived, one of its meanings is late 16th century, denoting a phantom or a ghost, from the Latin meaning literally shade. I did a podcast with a guy called Lennon Honor, really fascinating researcher. He crops up in my first book as well. Going back to when the hit single Umbrella by Rihanna was released in 2007, and Lennon did some very in-depth analysis into the symbolism behind that particular video. And his conclusion was that when she talks about being under your umbrella, and being under your protection. What she's actually talking about is being under the influence of a demonic entity which has come to possess her. Lots of evidence to back up that idea when you get into that particular song and video. But it's interesting to ponder on the meaning of the Beatles sitting there under umbrellas in this particular album sleeve. Moving on to the album soundtrack for Help in 1965, we have the Beatles seemingly doing these semaphore hand signals. So you automatically assume that what they're doing is spelling out H-E-L-P, the 4 letters of help, but it turns out that's not actually the case. According to the photographer in this particular photo shoot, Robert Freeman, I had the idea of semaphore spelling out the letters help, but when we came to do the shot, the arrangement of the arms with those letters didn't look good. So we decided to improvise and ended up with the best graphic positioning of other arms. Well, it turns out that what's actually going on here is that the Beatles are spelling out certain grade signs which are a part of the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, one of these occult secret society fraternities of which Aleister Crowley was at the helm for some time. So very roughly, with some variation, we see the 4 members of the group striking these particular grade symbols, symbolizing Osiris slain, Isis mourning, Apophis and Osiris risen. Which becomes interesting, right? Then we have a rare Dutch version of this help sleeve where you've got the 4 Beatles striking these same poses in front of what appears to be the corporate logo of the Shell Oil Corporation. Except that's never been a Shell. All along, that corporate logo has symbolized the rays of the rising sun. So we're back to solar worship cults here in terms of the symbolism being conveyed. This is the sleeve to the Rolling Stones album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request. Interesting name on any level. This was released at the end of 1967. It was very much a pastiche of the Beatles album Sgt. Pepper, which had been released 6 months earlier. And you can see from the album sleeve there, the design is very similar to the Peter Blake designed sleeve that was used on Sgt. Pepper. It's pretty much a rip-off of it. But very cleverly embedded in the artwork to this album, we can see the 4 Beatles, Paul, George, John and Ringo. It's indicating there where they appear in the image, but they've been subliminally put into the image to go straight into the subconscious mind of the viewing public for whatever reason. Here are the Beatles hanging out with Jimmy Savile. Now, people might say, anyone that was in the pop business in the 1960s would have known Jimmy Savile because he was the host of Top of the Pops and all the groups were associated with him. But the Beatles seem to have quite an association with Savile. He introduced many of their shows on some of their UK tours and would travel around from gig to gig with them. Here he is in a black and white checkerboard coat design, going back to the image that we saw earlier, the black and white checkerboard coming out of Freemasonry. And I think the other guy there, third along on the back, is Tony Prince of Radio Luxembourg, I believe, who was also a big radio DJ in those times. Here are the Beatles posing with Savile, and they're all pretending to be asleep or in a trance, possibly. I mean, I'm throwing everything in here, as you can see. Here we have an interesting image where John and Paul are placing their right arm, inside the sleeve of their coat. And this is another very blatant sign of Freemasonry, which we've seen represented through the centuries by various public figures and world leaders and dignitaries and celebrities. Here they are striking the same pose. Here's some of the famous people through history that have been pictured striking that very same pose. Would that just be coincidence? Would it just be an arty, fun thing to do in a photo shoot? Or is there more being communicated here? Are they letting you know what it is they're a part of? Elite society, the privileged chosen few, the ranks that are reserved just for those influencers of society and not for regular members of the public, going back to the original question of whether these really were just 4 working class lads from Liverpool who just happened to make it big. And we have the Masonic idea being conveyed here in this additional photo. So this is George Martin, who I mentioned briefly earlier. He was a wizard producer, sonic sorcerer, engineer. He started out his career, or got much of his training, in the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. And this was the place that experimented with sound and looked at different ways in which sound frequencies could be employed in different situations. They came up with the very distinctive, eerie theme tune to Doctor Who, way back when that started in 1963. So George Martin worked for a while at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. He put out a couple of records actually under the pseudonym of Ray Cathode. And this was in the days before he became the Beatles producer. And as the group's career took off, he very quickly stepped in to become what was known as the fifth Beatle. And he was very instrumental in shaping their sound, particularly when they went into their latter period, post-1966, when they started introducing the orchestras and their arrangements became very complex. And the group would spend time in the studio perfecting the sound of their records. When they had stopped touring, they just put all their efforts into their studio productions. So George Martin had a part in that. He was very much a part of the British establishment, came from an aristocratic family, he was knighted, all the usual credentials. I'll skip over that because it's a bit wordy, and I'm going to skip over that as well. These are very loose connections between the Beatles and Laurel Canyon. When you get into the work of Dave McGowan and other researchers that have taken up the mantle in terms of looking at the hippie counterculture scene coming out of California in the mid to late 1960s, and all the evidence that there is to show that so many, if not all, of the prominent musicians from those times who very much shaped the culture of those years came from establishment military backgrounds. When you look at what the fathers, what the grandfathers did, you go back into the ancestry, you find links time and time again into military intelligence, different expressions of the armed forces, the government, the Pentagon, Ivy League universities, all of this. All the kind of connections you wouldn't necessarily expect to find from the fathers of gritty working class musicians, if that's what they really were. So there are a few loose, tenuous links between the Beatles and the Laurel Canyon crowd, but I'll spare you that today because it will take up too much time, but it's all there in the books. Paul McCartney's latest album, Egypt Station. Yeah, he's still churning them out. You might think at the age of 77 or whatever he is, he might feel like just kicking it back and taking it easy. It's not as if he has to work to pay the bills anymore. He will tell you that he still goes out there and tours and still churns out the albums because he still loves it. That's what Mick Jagger says, that's what Tom Jones says, that's what Bob Dylan says, that's what Elton John says, that's what they all say. They just keep going. It's my suspicion that these individuals who are at the very top of the pecking order are not allowed to retire. They are assets of the system that spawned them, and they're also cash cows, and they're required to keep going out there, keep churning out the product. It's partly to generate huge profits for the record companies, and it's partly because of the mind control and the social engineering and the culture creation aspects of what it is that they do. But either way, they're all still out there, all the old timers, all the sirs. Have you noticed these sirs never retire? They just keep performing. So McCartney put out this album last year, Egypt Station. We're back to Egyptian symbology, going back to some of those earlier links, and there's plenty of connections through the years there as well. He put out the album Ram back in the 1970s. We have this depiction of a ram on the cover. He also had an album under the pseudonym of Percy Thrillington, an orchestral album released in the 70s, where he appears with a ram's head. And in Egyptian mythology, the ram symbolizes, Matt, help me out, is it Horus?
Yeah, in a roundabout way it does, yeah.
I had a mental block there, but yeah, a ram's head is one of the ways in which the figure of Horus in solar Egyptian mythology was symbolized. I'm going to leave the frog one to you because this came from your site. This is an amazing one, but I'll let Matt explain that one. Back to some more suspect imagery. We have the Beatles with Hannibal Lecter style face masks on. What the hell is going on here? We have John Lennon with a flower placed over one of his eyes. So again, it's drawing attention to the other eye and evoking the one eye symbolism that we get in Freemasonry and other occult mystery schools. We've got McCartney scratching one of his eyes through the decades, many years apart, these pictures, and he's striking the same pose, if indeed it is the same individual in these pictures, which we're going to get onto in part 2. But very interesting that his finger is going to the same eye, creating the same effect, all these different years apart. On the sleeve to the Yellow Submarine album, we've got a couple of very familiar symbols which crop up in music videos from the contemporary era. If you look at videos from all these pop puppets that we have now, Miley Cyrus and Taylor Swift and Beyonce and Rihanna and Kanye West and all these other jokers, you'll see time and time again a depiction of this hand sign, which is supposed to mean okay. So the cover story it means yeah, okay, everything's cool. But within secret society and dark occultist circles, this is another indication of 666. So you have the figure 6 with the 3 fingers indicating that it's 3 times the 6. This is a number very beloved of occultists. It's not necessarily an evil number in itself. In its base state, it is neutral until it has meaning and intent and energy applied to it. But in the hands of dark occultist sorcerers who don't necessarily have humanity's best interests at heart, they take that number and they twist it and use it to their own ends. And I don't think McCartney is telling us that everything is okay here. Similarly, this hand sign, sometimes you see it with the palm to the front, sometimes you see it reversed, sometimes you see it with the thumb extended, sometimes the thumb is tucked in. And the cover story for this one is that it means, in deaf sign language, I love you. It's supposed to be the I and the L and the U. But again, within occultist circles, this is an evocation of, first of all, Baphomet, this androgynous entity which is revered within Satanist circles and certain occult mystery schools, and also the horned pagan god known as Pan. So we see this cropping up time and time again. Interestingly, in the cartoon version of Yellow Submarine, we can see George flashing that same symbol that Lennon was in the earlier picture. Then we get on to Yoko. What are we to make of Yoko? I mean, she actually put out a record called Yes, I'm a Witch, as if, pictures like this leave you in any doubt. And there's a very strong suggestion among Beatles fans and, Lennon fans in particular, that Yoko was sent into the Beatles camp and into Lennon's world specifically in order to become some kind of mind control handler of his. Certainly, John's personality changed greatly after Yoko came on the scene. In the early days of the Beatles, he was the joker, the clown. He was always larking about in interviews and cracking jokes and was always very jovial. Then Yoko comes on the scene. He seems to undergo this radical personality shift. And as we go into the 1970s, he starts making this incredibly politically aware, conscious message music, which is a far cry from the songs that he was writing in the 60s. That would appear to be under the influence in some way of Yoko, and people might say, well, he was putting out incredible music in those times, which was inspiring and uplifting to people, so was it all so bad? But I think there was more going on beneath the surface than many people have given credit for. With Yoko, she comes from a Japanese banking dynasty on her father's side. He was the head of a banking corporation coming out of Japan, and he spent a lot of his time in the United States. They would travel back and forth between Japan and the US. And on her mother's side, she was descended from Japanese aristocracy, and specifically from the former emperor of Japan. So she came from effectively royalty in that country. Do we have the thing about Scarsdale? Yeah, here it is. So this is Yoko pictured with Linda Eastman, who became Linda McCartney, of course, Paul's wife, around about the same time that John married Yoko. Very interestingly, Linda grew up in a town in Westchester County, New York State, known as Scarsdale. So she attended high school there, and she spent her formative years in Scarsdale. Yoko Ono's family moved over for a period from Japan to New York State and settled in the town of Scarsdale, which most people have never heard of outside of Beatles mythology. So Yoko spent her formative years growing up in Scarsdale at the same time that Linda was there. And then both of them go on to become wives of Beatles. So there's something we need to know about Scarsdale and how it is that both of these future Beatles wives ended up there. There she is, yes, I'm a witch, as if there was any doubt, complete with her AI transhumanism sunglasses as well to complete the effect. This is Sean Lennon. I mean, what hope did he ever stand with Yoko as a mother, right? Strange guy. Here he is with an Aleister Crowley style pyramid hat with the Eye of Providence on it, the Eye of Horus. And his videos are absolutely replete with occult symbolism from start to finish, as are Julian's, John's other son. So Julian was the son that he had with his first wife, Cynthia. And unfortunately, you see in Julian's artwork and his promotional photos and such, they're full of the same tired old Illuminati symbolism that you see in Sean's work and in so many of these other owned assets. John and Paul giving it a very interesting handshake, very Masonic in nature, not your average kind of handshake. Here's Paul striking a pose which, again, the cover story will tell you that he's spelling out the W of Wings for his group Wings, but it becomes very indicative of the square and the compass within Masonic imagery when you superimpose this image on it. And I feel that that's what's being subliminally communicated here. So you see many renderings of Freemasonic symbolism and imagery coming through in the Beatles pictures here. This is a very infamous, notorious record sleeve coming from June 1966, the 666. So it was called Yesterday and Today, and this was the initial pressing of this album coming out of Capitol Records in the US. You'll notice that it's quite unusual in terms of what it depicts, and people at the time noticed it as well. So you've got the four Beatles sitting in white lab coats, and they've got raw meat draped all over them, as well as toy dolls with dislocated limbs, with the head snapped off and the arms snapped off and all of this. And there was outrage when this sleeve first appeared. It was seemingly intended to generate this outrage and to have who knows what other kind of effect on the public. But the initial stash of albums that were released with this sleeve design were instantly recalled and replaced with another image due to the outcry which occurred. So there were several pictures taken within the photo shoot done by a guy called Robert Whitaker. These albums, if you've got an original one now, particularly if you've got one with the new album design slapped over the top of the old one, so they just put a sticker to cover up the old image, but it still lies beneath it. So if you've got one of these original albums, they do fetch a fairly hefty sum. One went just the other week for 180 grand. And that one was owned by John Lennon, reportedly. So this is the image that was used to replace the original Yesterday and Today sleeve. In this one, you see that the group are huddled around an old-fashioned steamer trunk. And this was in the days of passenger ships, where people would put all their belongings into one of these big chests, one of these big sea chests. And you've got Paul, if it's him, sitting inside one of these steamer trunks. Now, there's an interesting interpretation which was put on this by a researcher online, and it ties into what we're going to look at in part 2 with the whole McCartney affair. So this person stated, the Yesterday and Today album cover is a representation of the story of Osiris, back to Egyptian mythology, whose body parts were put into a casket that washed up on the shore and was found by Isis, his wife. The original butcher cover represented Osiris having been chopped into 13 pieces by his brother Set. You remember the raw meat and the mutilated dolls. In any case, the Paul sitting in the steamer trunk picture represents Osiris. In the legend, Isis reassembled the body parts, brought the body back to life long enough to have sex with it, and subsequently bore Horus, who avenged his father's death by engaging Set in a battle. The two Pauls, this person said, represent Osiris and Horus, the same guy in two bodies, a rubber soul occupying two bodies. In order for Beatles fans to connect the dots, there had to be clues about a death. And yesterday and today, this person says, was a phrase used in ancient Egypt describing Osiris, in the same way that people say Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever in this era. Well, that's certainly a tantalizing interpretation to put on the meaning of both of these sleeves, right? They've got to mean something. Looking at some untimely and unusual, and in many cases unexplained deaths surrounding the Beatles now. These become quite fascinating to study. So we've already discussed Stuart Sutcliffe up in the top left there. In the middle top we have Brian Epstein, the longtime Beatles manager. He died on the 27th of August 1967. And we're told that it was of a drugs overdose at his own hand, so it was chalked up as suicide. But there are many suspicious aspects to it. This was immediately after the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper period, during the Summer of Love of 1967. So the group had undergone its metamorphosis. They'd embarked on this new psychedelic adventure that they were on with their music. Sgt. Pepper was already having a major effect on the culture and the zeitgeist of those times, and then Epstein checks out at the age of 32. From that point on, the Beatles are effectively without a manager. You know, various people try to hold their affairs together, but that's the end of the original era of the Beatles. It's almost symbolic in that Epstein checks out at that particular point in the timeline. On the far right at the top, we have Dr. Richard Asher, who was a neurologist. He was a hypnotherapist, or he was a scientist, a doctor that studied the effects of hypnosis and dream states and mind control techniques. He worked at the Central Middlesex Hospital, yeah, close to London. So he was the father of Jane Asher, who was Paul McCartney's girlfriend for a big part of the 1960s. She was an accomplished actress in her own right. And she had a brother called Peter Asher, who, have I got a picture of him here? No, but anyway, Peter Asher looks like one part Ed Sheeran, one part Austin Powers when you see a picture of him. He was part of the group Peter and Gordon, and Paul McCartney is said to have written a couple of songs for them, including their hit single, A World Without Love. And he was also one of the part owners or partners in the Indica Art Gallery, which had a very pivotal role in the counterculture avant-garde art scene of the 1960s. Paul McCartney was a partner in that business as well. But anyway, back to Richard Asher, father of Jane. We have this very unusual situation where Paul McCartney moved in to the Asher household in Wimpole Mews, London. This was where Dr. Asher had his medical practice. And immediately upon McCartney moving in, we hear that he quit his post at the Central Middlesex Hospital and made himself home-based and focused all his studies from his home practice there. McCartney is said to have written many of his famous and most influential songs while he was living in the Asher household, including, very notably, Yesterday. And there's a researcher by the name of Redwell Trabant, which I'm sure is an anagram, but I've not worked out what it is yet. He's got a great blog online. In one of his articles, he speculates on whether part of Dr. Asher's research work involved trying to implant thoughts and melodies of songs into the minds of his subjects when they were in hypnotic states or in deep sleep states. And this person is speculating on whether that's what Paul McCartney may have been doing living in the Asher household. He was being used as a test subject for Dr. Asher's work. By the way, Dr. Asher's wife, Jane's mother, was a music teacher. She was engaged with the Guildhall School of Music, and among other students that she had on her books was George Martin. She taught him to play oboe and piano and other instruments. So she was a music composer in her own right. And this writer, Redwell Trabant, wonders whether McCartney, in some kind of dream state, may have subliminally absorbed the melody to Yesterday and possibly other songs, and then believed that he'd written these songs himself. There are accounts of McCartney approaching friends when he'd woken up one morning with the melody to the song Yesterday in his head. He says he just woke up and it was there. And he asked his friends if they'd ever heard the song before. He would play them the chords because he was concerned that he may have plagiarized it from somewhere else, having absorbed it without realizing. So it all lends some potential weight to this theory that that's what might be going on in the Asher household. Anyway, either way, Dr. Richard Asher in 1969 goes missing for several days, and then he turns up dead in the basement of his house. And this one is also chalked up as suicide. Richard Asher lived just a stone's throw away from Dr. Stephen Ward, who was a society osteopath, very highly connected in elite social circles in 1960s London. His medical practice was just a short walk away, and he too is said to have committed suicide in 1963. And there's some very loose connections there to the Beatles with Dr. Stephen Ward as well, which Matt documents in his blog. Dr. Stephen Ward was embroiled in the whole Profumo political scandal of the 1960s. So that's three of them. Then down the bottom on the left, we have Mel Evans. Alongside Neil Aspinall, Mel Evans was the other trusted, close confidant of the Beatles. He worked as a roadie and as a personal assistant. And when the Beatles broke up, he evidently started to assemble his memoirs. And by 1976, he was all poised to publish his memoirs, his biography of his years working and touring with the Beatles. So he had the manuscript all ready to go. On the 5th of January 1976, Mel Evans just happens to get into an altercation with LA police, in which he gets shot to death. And after this point, the manuscript for the book that he was due to deliver to his publisher very shortly afterwards goes missing, and no trace of it has been seen to this day. John Lennon, most of us probably know the circumstances behind his assassination in December 1980. I won't dwell on it here. And then finally, George Harrison, who almost 20 years ago, it's the end of 1999, a guy called Michael Abram broke into his house, Friar Park, Henley-on-Thames, bypassing evidently one of the most state-of-the-art advanced security systems of the time, somehow managed to get through it, and got into a fight with George Harrison on his stairs and stabbed him up several times. And it was only the intervention of George's wife, Olivia, which caused the guy to refrain from his attack. George gave interviews afterwards saying that he was convinced he was going to die, and he was trying to get himself into the correct spiritual state to cross over because he was convinced this guy was going to stab him to death. And this was presumably the plan, for him to have been taken out in the same way that Lennon was. So George survives, but not for long. 2 years later, in 2001, at the age of 58, he died from complications arising from different cancers, which had evidently been brought on as a result of this attack 2 years earlier. So some very turbulent deaths there in the world of the Beatles. And this is the point where I normally take a break and go into the McCartney material in part 2, but I think we'll invite Matt to step up now and present to us what he's got. I think a lot of it is building on things that I've already mentioned, but he's got a lot of other original material as well. Just give me 1 minute while I line up his slides.
Mojo about the whole place. Yes, I was a DJ. I think I should just explain a little bit about myself, just in case you're wondering who is this bozo that's just walked up on here, who the hell's he? Yes, I was a club DJ, even though I retired from it, because I couldn't, like Mark says, I couldn't take the music anymore. I do feel it was a privilege that I managed to leave school and from childhood want to be in music and want to be a DJ, and I feel really, really privileged that I had the gall and the front and the balls to just go with it and actually make a living from it, from leaving school up until about 5 or 6 years ago. So I do feel very privileged about that. I would actually say that the reason I got into DJing in the first place was because of the Beatles. Not personally, they didn't come round to my house or anything, but my sister is 9.5, 10 years older than me. So when I was about 3, 4, she was 14. She was a teenage girl. She was buying records. And I just seemed to remember when she was buying records, when I was about 3 or 4, I just seemed to gravitate towards the record player and just look at the records that she was buying. And she had a really good taste, actually. She had the Space Oddity album, T-Rex, Jeepster, I seem to recall, and a few other bits and pieces. But there was just these 2 albums that I just kept playing over and over and over again. The other ones were interesting, like Slade and all that kind of stuff, but there was just 1 particular or 2 particular albums that really interested me, and I don't know why it was captivating me so much. And they were, if you know about the Beatles and you're a bit of a sado when it comes to this kind of thing, you might know what they are. It was the Blue and the Red albums. So you've got the Red one, which is a double album, 1962 to 66, which is basically all the singles, all the UK hit singles, plus a few album tracks which were deemed classics. And then you had that one from 62 to 66, and then the Blue one, which was 67. So it was Sgt. Pepper's, Strawberry Fields onwards until the breakup in 1970. And just on a little tangent, because I think it is quite relevant, well, bloody very relevant, blue and red is the Masonic colours, of course, so makes you wonder. They did say at the time that the reason they picked red and blue is because of Liverpool and Everton, the football teams, but I do wonder. Anyway, so as the years roll on, I get to, my 30s and I start getting into alternative knowledge. And it's only natural when you start investigating stuff and looking at stuff on the internet, as you start to engage in this kind of information, that if you're into music, you're going to start looking at, the music industry and history and what you've been given, what you've been fed. And because I was a massive, massive Beatles fan, who followed their career from when I was a child, from when I listened to those records, all the way through my life, was inspired enough to become a DJ because I got into music through listening to them. And as I got older, as I was an older child, I started to buy books and magazines, and I started to study the history. So by the time I got into alternative knowledge, of course, it's only natural that I'm going to start looking at the Beatles from a alternative angle. And that's brought me here. And it's a pleasure. And yes, so this is the Occult Beatles. This is basically the header, the title of the website. If you go onto the Occult Beatles website, that's what you'll see. And it's basically a workaround of that. And basically what I'm going to do while I'm here is basically just go back on what Mark's been talking about so far tonight. I think that's the best thing to do, is to kind of be like the support band to the main act and just pick up on a few things that he's already talked about, and just to elaborate on them and add a few bits and pieces in that interest me and that I've picked up on from having watched this talk already before. So we got With the Beatles, the second album, which was released on November 22nd, 1963, the very day of John F. Kennedy's death. The official story for this design that they went for, that the Beatles actually wanted to have, is that it was Robert Freeman, wasn't it, off the top of my head? The photographer, Robert Freeman, he came and he took this picture. And the reason they picked Robert Freeman was because they liked his style of photography. He was quite famous for doing black and white photographs. He photographed like jazz musicians, I think, according to the official history. He'd already sort of made a name for himself for doing black and white photos of jazz musicians. So they went for this guy, and that's the official story, that they went for that because he was so talented. And I'm sure there is some truth to that. Just an interesting little aside, and this is according to paulmccartney.com, if I'm not mistaken. The Beatles were so adamant that they wanted this picture that they actually almost went to war with EMI to have it come out. Now, if you think about it, we're talking late 1963. So the Beatles have only been going in the public eye in terms of national fame, sort of bordering on international fame. It's starting to get out there into Europe. So we're talking maybe a year, just a little bit less than a year because it's November 63. And they are so intent on getting this picture, which is so full of symbolism, they're so intent on getting this out to the consternation of EMI, so we're told. Because if you sort of look back to that time, we're talking Beatlemania. We're right into Beatlemania. It's starting to take hold. And the Beatles are sold as these four cheeky chappies, the four lovable mop tops, fun, laughing, joking, having a bit of a laugh, like Mark mentioned earlier about John Lennon. They can't stop joking about, and that's what kind of like sold them to Britain initially. So EMI didn't want this. They said, what are you doing, guys? We're coming out with this album. They've presented them with this photograph. They said, are you serious? You're the four lovable mop tops. You're having a bit of a laugh. Why are you coming out with... For a start, it's black and white. Why is it not colour? We're not like living in the 1940s anymore. And why aren't you smiling? Why are you smiling? And why are you covering your faces all in black and wearing black? And apparently, the Beatles pretty much went to war with EMI. They said, we want this cover out. And EMI said, well, we really don't think so. Remember, this is pretty much in the early points of their career. They could have completely effed up their chances. EMI, all right, they were making a lot of money off EMI, but at the same time, the Beatles were, early on in their career, it could have gone, they had to be careful. They hadn't yet sealed a worldwide reputation. They weren't superstars yet, but they wanted that out, and they were willing to risk their record contract, I would suggest, to have that out. Now, if I was in a band and I was in that situation, I would just say, do you know what? All right then, well, it's only a record cover. All right, have it. All right, okay, we won't do it. Do something else. But no, the Beatles wanted it, so that's what happened. Okay, official story. Right, okay, Robert Freeman is said to have taken this picture. There's a lady by the name of Astrid Kircher. You've probably heard of her. She was one of the... she started off as a fan of the Beatles back in their days in Liverpool. And she used to go to their club in Hamburg where they were playing. And she was an artist, a photographer. She still is. She's still with us. And she has intimated that this picture was actually copied from her. She's not said that it's been plagiarized, but she's pretty much saying it in a polite way, if you like. Back in 1960, I think it was, or 61, can't quite remember. Actually, I think it might have been 62, because Stuart had just died. The Beatles had gone back to Hamburg to honour some dates before returning back to Britain again. And you see, the thing is that Astrid is suggesting that they wanted this because it's based on her pictures. Here's a shot that Astrid took. It's got her name on the bottom. This is George and John, obviously, with the half shadow thing. And this was apparently taken in Stuart Sutcliffe's flat shortly after his death. There's another one. That's Astrid as well. And so's that one. That's George. And there's her signature at the bottom. Hope she doesn't do me for copyright. Another friend who was in with the whole Hamburg crowd and who was also friends with Astrid was a guy by the name of Jürgen Vollmer. And he's actually, I'm not going to go too much into this, but he's actually the guy that's credited with the Beatle haircut, for inventing the Beatle haircut, because he's the guy that, he used to comb his hair down. It was like an arty kind of statement man. And he got the Beatles into doing that. Sometime in about 1961, he went to work as a photographer for a guy by the name of William Klein, who was a French photographer, I'm told, a notable French photographer and filmmaker. And in 1962, February 1962, William appeared in a film in which there was that, which is a year and a half before the With the Beatles album came out. Okay, so and this is where I'm having to revert to my notes here because I'm going to go off into like weird theory land. I'm going off the facts and I'm going off into weird, and I was really scared about doing this, and I was still working on this today, and you can see how messy it is. It's like I've scribbled this about 5 or 6 times now, and I'm still not happy. There's another original. Look at that one. And I'm now gonna grapple myself through this, right, man? Okay, here we go. Right, yeah, here we go. So this is the 4 Faces that came out a year and a half before the Beatles album, and as far as I can tell, the Beatles have never, ever, ever mentioned this film. They've never mentioned this scene from the film. It's from a 1962 film, as I say, a film by Chris Marker. It's a French film called La Jetée, which means the jetty, and in a nutshell, it's a film about a post-nuclear invasion world. It's set in France. It's Paris. With the opening scenes, we see Paris. It's completely demolished, and we now have a new world where the people of Paris have moved underground into a cavern, if you like. They're living underground. We already have a hierarchical system going on. We have a set of rulers who rule over these people that they subject mind control experiments to. And the point of these mind control experiments, which is done through sleep, we're back to the sleep hypnosis thing again, is to somehow tap into their memories and into their dreams and find a time loophole. I'm not really sort of like au fait when it comes to science fiction, so do forgive me if I go a little bit. But yeah, so it's basically to manipulate the time loophole so that they can go through into someone's past, through their dreams, through their memories, and to somehow bring back from that past, physically, help, assistance, anything they can get to make the present life that they're living in, this apocalyptic world, make it livable. So that's the aim of these mind control subjects, or the subjects through these experiments. And there's one particular man who's we don't get the name of, who's the main protagonist in the film, and he gives out the strongest kind of response to these experiments, and he keeps dipping back to this girl who's from the past, and he keeps going back to the past, he keeps going back to the past. And there's another scene, well, it's not that one, it's this one. This is the scene towards the end of the film that he goes to. This is the future. And these people are in the post-invasion world, if you like. So basically, what they say to him is, come join us in this new world, this new future. And he says, I don't want it. I want to go back to the woman. I want to go back to the past. I don't want your future. I want to go back there. It's said to have been based on 12 Monkeys. Terry Gilliam has absolutely denied that. If you look on Wikipedia, they'll say that yes, he did base 12 Monkeys on this film, but he says not. It's up to you. Do watch it. It's only about 20 minutes long. Actually, it's on my website. If you look, you'll find it. It's the video's at the bottom. It's called La Jetée. Right, here we go into the crazy, wacky stuff. Okay, so here we go, right? I've written this down and I've rewritten it, and I was up again at 8 o'clock this morning, rewrite, biro, the whole lot. It's a blooming mess. Here we go. Right, so this is what I've got. This, okay, came out, just bear with me, right? Take into account that we're talking here tonight about agendas. We're talking about a world we live in where things are mapped out for us. Pretty much everything isn't organic. Agendas, scenarios, social engineering. You know where I'm going with this, right? We're talking about a world where things are mapped out for us to make it look like they're not. So everything is an agenda. So this came out a year and a half before with the Beatles album, right? So, and as I say, there's been no mention by anyone, not the Beatles, not Jürgen. It could be that there was an influence, but Jürgen has never said anything about this. And the only reason I'm mentioning Jürgen is because I found that out myself from doing a bit of research. Jürgen has never said anything about this being an influence on the Beatles with the Beatles cover. And also, it could be that he went and he said to William Klein, who was in the film, hey, Have you heard of my mate Astrid? She's a really good photographer. How about you try this kind of thing? But there's been nothing. There's been absolutely nothing, not from the Beatles, not from anybody. So here's the wacky theory. This came out a year and a half before the album. Okay, so there's been no mention by anybody about this. Were these heads here, okay, were they symbolically, not only in the film, a foretaste of the future within this film, within the context of the story of the film, but was it a warning of the real future, of our real world? When this came out in 62, were they telling us about what was going to happen in our world from 1962, the very year the Beatles signed their contract, the Beatles released their first single? Was this a warning of what was going to come with the Beatles, that we were coming to a new age, a new culture, and so on and so on? Okay, it's a bit wacky because there's nothing to say that that's what's going on here, but I'm just saying, what if there is some kind of weird and wacky thing here where there's like a symbolic, occult thing going on where they're warning us about the Beatles coming, or at least that we're going to be entering a new age, a post-invasion future, being the post-invasion being, of course, the British invasion. It's just something to think. I'm not going to dwell on that too much because, as I say, it's just something that came to my head. So, With the Beatles was released in November 63, the day of JFK's assassination, and as we say, 3 months later, we have this invasion, this British invasion, and that's not what the alternative media call it, that's what the mainstream call it. It was a British invasion. It was led by the Beatles, and they went to America and brought with them these other acts behind them in this kind of tidal wave. So you have the Stones and the Animals and so on and so forth. It is a bit weird because if you think about it, why would the Beatles captivate America when you think that basically what the Beatles were doing is they'd recycled R&B music, rock and roll, which was American, and they were basically selling it back to the Americans, so which is a bit weird. So, but because when you think about it, it was the American, the youth culture in America pretty much dictated what was going on in the late 1950s into the early 60s. Up until the Beatles came along, the youth culture in Britain and most of Europe was taking in American rock and roll, American youth culture. It was trying to copy it. And every time that the British or the Europeans tried their own brand of rock and roll, a la Cliff Richard, it was pale, it was rubbish. It was mainly, there wasn't much that Britain could really do in terms of rock and roll to stand. And then all of a sudden, the Beatles turn up and just spin it upside down. Now, a lot of people have tried to make sense of this. What was going on? John Coleman, of course, that Mark mentioned earlier, he says that the whole point of this invasion was to bring on this social engineering exercise. It was the introduction, the first wave, if you like, of an invasion to debase the family unit, to introduce drug culture, to introduce drug culture into youth culture, to make drugs ready available to young people, and also to debase, if you like, religion, to take it away from the organised sort of family unit and to sort of spear it off into different directions. The mainstream will say that the reason this happened was because they were, the Americans were still in shock. They were still in shock over Kennedy, the assassination of Kennedy, which took place 3 months earlier on the release of With the Beatles. And where did the Beatles begin their invasion? At JFK Airport. So take that any way you want to. It's very, very symbolic. When you look at the counterculture and you look at LSD, for example, and the way it was administered in later years, and which the Beatles were flag wave bearers of, most notably through Sgt. Pepper, of course. Let's not forget this one, what John Lennon said about 2-3 months before he was shot down for Playboy magazine. He says, "We must always remember to thank the CIA and the army for LSD." That's what people forget. They invented LSD to control people, and he wasn't bloody lying either. Something else that happened on the day that With the Beatles was released was Aldous Huxley died on that very day, in that very year. Aldous Huxley, of course, the philosopher, the great speaker, the thinker, the author of the book Brave New World, which, of course, tells a story of a totalitarian world in which people are controlled, but not knowing they're controlled because they're controlled through recreational drugs. A book that was written in the 1930s and which seemed to be living out in reality a little bit later on in the 1960s. And of course, Aldous Huxley became a bit of a godfather for the 1960s because, for example, The Doors, From the Doors of Perception, his book, was inspired. Jim Morrison was inspired to take on the name, and his bandmates were inspired to take on that name from that very book that Aldous Huxley wrote. So we're into the 60s now and the counterculture. I will just mention also that in Brave New World there was a drug that was called Soma. And at this point I shall mention Steve Abrams. Steve Abrams was a pivotal figure in the 1960s London counterculture. He was American born, he was a parapsychologist, and in about 1960 he moved to Britain and he started to study at Oxford University, and then after that he started to work there. Just take a quote here. He headed a parapsychological laboratory at the university's, Oxford University's Department of Biometry, and having some skills in hypnosis, he investigated extrasensory stimulation of conditioned reflexes in hypnotized subjects. This man was the founder of Soma, which we're told stands for the Society of Mental Awareness. In actual fact, yes, it was called that, but it was a pivotal organization in the counterculture. Anyway, as I say, he began earlier on in the 60s at Oxford University. He was part funded by the Human Ecology Fund, which has since been found to be a CIA front for MKUltra. He since claimed in a book that he had no idea that this was going on, that he was just duped. Make of it what you will. A couple of years after that, he was a pivotal figure in the London counterculture. And the biggest thing that, and I'll just point out actually that the Human Ecology Fund, the whole point of it was to fund social scientists. So we're talking about the 60s and they're funding social sciences. Interesting, I think. So the biggest claim to fame for Soma was this one-page advert. I think it was in the Times newspaper, and it came out in 1967, and it was calling for the relaxing in the laws of drug laws, especially to do with cannabis. And this is what the Soma advert was all about. It featured signatures from none other than R.D. Laing, the Tavistock psychiatrist. He was also known as the counterculture's in-house psychiatrist. He was Tavistock through and through for many years. Also signing this kind of petition type thing were the Beatles, of course, also Brian Epstein, David Dimbleby, David Bailey, the photographer, also the Craze very good friend, Tom Dryberg. So yeah, and actually this did make a difference. A couple of years later, when I think it was the Wootton report came out, courtesy of Harold Wilson, some of the cannabis laws were brought down, and that was because of this very advert. The advert was paid for by Paul McCartney, 1,800 quid for that advert. The board of directors, now this is where, you think in Soma, Society of Mental Awareness. Okay, maybe. Then you look at the board directors. Okay, you got R.D. Laing, Tavistock, and you've also got Francis Huxley, nephew of Aldous. So there you go, make of it what you will. Okay, so there's With the Beatles. As I say, I'm just picking up on stuff that Mark has been talking about here. We've got the With the Beatles album. Again, same photographer as the one as the With the Beatles album. And like Mark said, it's meant to be flag semaphore. Okay, first alarm bell. I've watched the film many times. I might be wrong because I have got a bad memory, as you can tell from all these bits of paper. But I do not recall. If this is a soundtrack for a film, right? Okay, they're dressed like that in the film. But where's the flag semaphore in the film? I don't recall there being flag semaphore in the film. Anyway, so the official story is that he wanted them to do flag semaphore of help. As Mark says, they went through that and it wasn't artistically pleasing enough to the eye. So they improvised. Oh, they improvised. They improvised. Oh, what a coincidence. Right? Okay, so what have we got here? We've got the elements. Earth, fire, water, and so on and so on. So we've got George is light. John is light. Paul, we'll come back to that in just a few seconds. And Ringo is the earth sign. And this is, you can't really tell from the writing there, but if you look at the writing there, it gives you the element signs. So you've got Ringo at the bottom, that's that one. The middle one, the two middle ones there, I think that one is water, and that one next to it is the Jay-Z sign. The triangle. Yeah, right, it's rocks. No, it's not, it's fire. And at the top, you've got more there. And so let's go back. So if you see where it says Crowley Magic, and presumably I've taken this from a website, another person who's done some really good work on this. I'm assuming they put a blank there because they think there's nothing for Paul. But if you go back and you look at the top one, top left, and then go one in, where the guy's like this. Okay, that's not an L as such. It stands for swastika. It's a light sign. It stands for swastika. All the top ones are light signs. And another way of pronouncing that is L, as in the letter L. So perhaps that is what he's doing there. So you've got light, light, swastika, earth. Back to this picture that Mark showed earlier. No, because he's dead, isn't he? Allegedly. Yeah, so the reason I come back to this is, like Mark says, this does not look like a natural pose. You know, I don't know many people who would sit there and like relax and then just do that. I mean, you have to force your hands to do that. You don't do it through relaxation, okay? So my question is, who is behind this photograph? Is it Jürgen, again, who was back with this other photo from the film? Did he tell Stuart to do this, or did Stuart tell him to do this? Because if we go back, you can't really see it, but if you go, you've got the two at the bottom, and you've got the two alongside each other. If you look on the left there, that's what he's doing. It's the water sign. Right? There you go. It's a bit clearer on that one. It's the water sign, isn't it? I think it is. So there we go. Let's give it a remix. So you've got light, light, swastika, earth, and water. Okay. That's just my take on it. Okay. Sticking with the earth signs, let's fast forward many decades. This is Sean Lennon's latest video, or most recent video. It's taken from a single, which I'm just having a look at here to get the full title of it. It's called Blood and Rockets, Movement 1, Saga of Jack Parsons' Movement 2, To the Moon. And as you can see, again, we've got the son of a Beatle messing about with the hooded figures at the back. If I'm not mistaken, I might be wrong, but I think that's the sound for silence that they're giving. And again, we've got the Jay-Z things there, but they're not Jay-Z, that's fire. Okay. So these are all scenes now, screen caps from Sean Lennon's latest video from this song. He said he based the whole video, the whole song, on a book called Sex and Rockets by John Carter. And the book is about this guy in the middle here, Jack Parsons. Obviously, it's been given a bit of a Terry Gilliam, Monty Python kind of delivery here in the actual music video. But then again, who knows what he was getting up to. Maybe that is lifelike, who knows. But yeah, that's Jack Parsons. Not only was he an occultist, he is actually credited by NASA, no less, as an originator of NASA. Back in the 30s, when he was very young, he was a rocket scientist, and he was a pioneer in rocket science with a few others. They formed a little organization or an association, which in later years became NASA. But he was also into the occult. He was a member of the AA, I think, or the OTO. I think it was the OTO actually, yes, that Mark mentioned earlier, the Freemasonic inspired order that Aleister Crowley headed. He took part in rituals, and there's of course Aleister on the left there, and on the right you've got Mr. Hubbard, who later formed the Scientology movement. Hubbard was friends with Jack Parsons, and they also took part in occult rituals together. Parsons was killed in an explosion on June the 17th, 1952, which is a day before Paul McCartney's 10th birthday. I just thought I'd throw that in. It was an accident. They say the explosion was an accident, but there are some who are close to Jack who say that at the time he was working on an occult ritual at the time, trying to bring to life a moon child, a living being, an elemental is what it's called. And actually Carter notes in his book Sex and Rockets that, and I quote, Parsons was known to invoke spirits called elementals, so called because of their association with the four elements of the ancients. So that's earth, air, water, fire. So we're back to that again, as we were before. The classical symbols associated with each are usually gnomes, sylphs, mermaids, and salamanders, respectively. He also performed sex rituals, which are said to have been based on the work of John Dee, the 16th century genius, who was not only an occultist, he was an astronomer, and he was also into navigation. He is said to be the man who coined the term the British Empire after he remodeled the British fleets to help them to sort of kind of take over the world, if you like. And he was also Queen Elizabeth the First's kind of sidekick, like an assistant, and she consulted him for the stars, you know. And what he did was he got together with a guy called Edward Kelly, who could actually summons the spirits, because what John Dee wanted to do, he was such a learned man apparently that he'd learned just about everything, but he really wanted to get to grapple what was the meaning of life. What is it? What the hell is it? So he got together with Edward Kelly, and they summoned some elementals and to try and find out. I don't think they did, but what they certainly did was get the Enochian alphabet. These beings gave them the Enochian alphabet. And this is what inspired Jack here to do his work. And he wrote the book called The Book of Babylon. He was trying to invoke the spirit of Babylon. I'll just mention this. He says in his own book that he wrote called The Book of Babylon, this is Jack Parsons, he says, Babylon, the nature of this force relates to love, understanding, and Dionysian freedom, which of course is what we got in the 60s with the counterculture. There's a few more, I'll just throw in a few more screen caps there of screen caps. I just thought I'd throw that one in because it's got the one eye. That's Jack Parsons. These are all from the video by Sean Lennon. There's Aleister Crowley, of course. Again, these are all from the video. So here's Sean Lennon featuring the very same picture that his dad had in the Sgt. Pepper cover, of course. And there's Sean in an earlier video. This is nothing to do with that one. This is from another music video with another band. And there he is wearing that hat, as you can see. Now, this is Sean again. I'm not sure if this is a TV program, if it's a TV program or whether it's like a YouTube thing, but it's called In My Room. And basically what it is a camera crew goes to the rooms of the famous people and takes a look either in their bedroom or their living room or wherever. This is in the room, a room of Sean Lennon's. And as you see, he's like picking out, the whole point of the program is to show the cameras like trinkets, little mementos, little decorations they've got in their room. And this is what Sean shows the cameras. It's the Knights of Malta Masonic hat. Yeah, so that's basically what that hat is. It's and the video, the one with Jack Parsons, is not just Sean Lennon. It's also a musician by the name of Les Claypool, and together this is called the Les Claypool Delirium. And what I was going to show next was some slides of, or at least one slide of John Lennon shaking hands with a Lord Mayor, and it's just seemingly like he's got the thumb over the knuckle kind of thing going on. And the next slide I was going to show after that was the slide of, here we go, I think these might be it, yeah? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we're talking there, Sean Lennon, and moving on to Masonic regalia and also Masonic handshakes, which I had a slide here of John Lennon doing a Masonic handshake. And I thought that would be a good point with the slides to go back to Liverpool, because as Mark says, there is something, you know, I don't know if it's, you know, is it, there we go, is it...
Go up and down with
us. Up and down, right, okay, cheers mate. Okay, so there you go, there's Sean there, we'll just go back, there you go, there is Sean with that Masonic hat. And there's Les Claypool, who I just mentioned, and he's wearing it. This is for the promo shoot of the latest album. He's wearing that hat. And there you go, as I mentioned, John. And if you look at the expression on his face, it looks like he's taking the mickey a little bit, like he's saying, yeah, we know what's going on. Okay, so back to Liverpool then. As I was saying earlier, like he showed Mark showed the slides of Thomas Sheridan and the suggestion that they were the Beatles were picking up on this stuff subconsciously. I would agree with that, but I think it might even go beyond. This is the tomb of William Mackenzie. This is in Liverpool. This is a graveyard which is situated near to where Brian Epstein was born. And he's called William Mackenzie. Not Father Mackenzie who wipes his hands as he walks from the grave, such as we get from the song Eleanor Rigby, where Paul McCartney kept insisting it wasn't about Eleanor Rigby, a real Eleanor Rigby, even though there is actually a gravestone in St. Peter's Church in Liverpool which is called Eleanor Rigby, and St. Peter's Church is where John and Paul were introduced to each other and then went on to form the Quarrymen. Anyway, this guy, William Mackenzie, I'm going to actually take the quote here from Bill Harry, who used to share a flat with John and Stuart when they were all at art school together. And Bill later formed Mersey Beat, which was like a local Liverpool music magazine. So if there were like gigs going on or any he'd do interviews with local bands and such like. So that's what he did. And then when the Beatles got famous, he got taken to London with them, and he worked for Brian Epstein, managing all the magazines, all the music magazines he was buying up. Anyway, this is what he says about William Mackenzie. And incidentally, Bill Harry in an interview recently, or quite a few years back actually, to be honest, said that we should call Liverpool Shiverpool, because it's absolutely full of this kind of stuff. So Bill Harry recounts this man who'd made a pact with the devil. He was a railway magnate who was completely hooked on gambling, and he gambled so much he was losing a fortune. And he said, I'll make a pact with the devil. I'll sell my soul to the devil if I can win this hand. So he did it. And it says he was so afraid that the devil would take his soul that he left instructions that when he died, he wasn't to be buried. He thought if he was buried sitting upright and not buried in the ground, then the devil wouldn't be able to take his spirit. There's a blog that I came across where there is a claim made by somebody else about this Mackenzie character. And this is what the claim was. The guy who's got the website actually put the email up on his website. He backed the early railways, this Mackenzie guy, and he financed George Stephenson's locomotive machines. He was seen as a pillar of the community and a backer of commerce and industry. But there was another unsavoury side to the man few people were aware of. He was a compulsive gambler and an ardent atheist. There were strange rumours about the man. In 1826, 11 bodies were found in barrels in the cargo hold of a ship at Liverpool docks. The police traced the barrels to a house at number 8 Hope Street. That house was being looked after by a James McGowan, who was an associate of Mackenzie. Anyway, the police arrested Mr. McGowan after they found 22 corpses of men, women and children that had been dug up from the local cemetery. Mr. McGowan refused to name names, but everyone suspected Mr. Mackenzie of being the instigator. There were whispers that he had turned number 8 Hope Street into a body snatcher's warehouse. So there you go, that's Freemasonic, perhaps? Apparently not. Apparently William Mackenzie was not a Freemason. Okay, right. So moving on to the cavern then. I was going to mention Penny Lane. I won't mention that too much. I'll just mention the fact that the man who Penny Lane is named after was James Penny, was a slave trader in Liverpool. So a lovely, cute little whimsical psychedelic song suddenly takes on a bit of a dark overtone, perhaps. Now, originally, I wasn't going to mention this ghost story, but I think I will because it kind of links in. Bill Harry, in this radio interview, also talked about a ghost story to do with the devil that everyone in Liverpool talks about. And the reason I didn't want to mention it is because a lot of people in Liverpool, some people believe in it, other people tend to think, oh no, I've heard so many different versions of this is rubbish. But this is what Bill says. Now, originally when the Cavern opened in the 50s, and it was a jazz club back then, didn't play pop music, it was said that the owner, Alan Sittner, he said that the crowds used to come down, and when the jazz bands had finished, some people sometimes stayed and sort of had like a chat. And anyway, they were talking about the occult one night, and they decided to have a seance and lit some candles, and they were calling for any spirit to come. And this poor man came around where they were standing, and they were quite sort of impressed by the magnetism of this man. And they asked him, they said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I am Lucifer." And one of them was a skeptic, one of these people who was sitting around. He says, "I don't believe you. It's a whole load of rubbish." And so the man said, "If you don't believe in me and are an atheist, then you wouldn't mind if you gave me your soul." So he says, "Yes, you can have my soul." And the man leaned over and then sort of disappeared. The guy called Peter collapsed. They took him to hospital. He was 27 years old and he died straight away. Now, in the 1970s, the Cavern Club was knocked down. The top half of the cavern, because of course it's a cellar club, the buildings that were above it were knocked down, so everything, all the rubble and everything just went straight down. The Cavern had closed in the mid-60s anyway. It lost money. It wasn't doing well after the Beatles had left, so it closed down. And then in the early 80s, excavation work began. And this is a piece from a book called The Cavern Club, The Rise of the Beatles and Merseybeat. And it states, when the cavern was excavated in 1982, the builders stumbled upon an old shaft that led into a huge hole, a cavern underneath the cavern, as it were. It was filled with water, and the architect and the site agent bravely investigated it in a rubber dinghy. The lake was 120 feet long and 70 feet wide, and in parts 8 foot deep. There was no other exit, and because of the scrapings in the sandstone wall, they could tell it was man-made. But why was it constructed? Why indeed? You can't really see the writing I've got there for you, but I'll just read it for you. This is on my website, and this is from research that I collated about this and put into kind of a paragraph. It's said to have been built by Matthew Pluckington, what I just explained, a wealthy 18th century merchant who owned the old dirt road above, one that eventually became an invaluable trade route, and then a street that bears his first name, and that's been made famous by the cavern. That's Matthew Street, of course. It's been claimed that he was a dabbler in the occult, and that the excavators' unexpected findings back in the early 80s were the remains of an underground temple that he'd built for his rituals. Okay, so moving on to another place where the Beatles played in the early days, and this is pre-Beatles actually. This is the Quarrymen. It's the Casbah that Mark has mentioned. Pete Best's mum owns the Casbah, and this is what Pete said. This is back in the day before the Beatles were really famous. This is when they were the Quarrymen. This is when they weren't even gigging. They weren't even looking to be the biggest band in Britain. They weren't even the biggest band in Liverpool. They weren't even the biggest band on their street. So when they were offered the chance to play at the Casbah, and then the Mona Best said to them, "But hey, if you want this dream gig, kids," because they were like 15, 16, 17, "if you want this dream gig, you've got to decorate the club." This is what Pete Best, and he said this many times over in different forms. He's never shied away from it. He said sometime in the early 2000s, the Quarrymen played in what we call the middle chamber, where the rainbow ceiling was. That was painted by Paul. And if you went into the first entrance of the club, there was a large dragon on the wall, which was painted by my mother. There were stars on the ceiling. There was an Aztec room, which had Egyptian graffiti and mystical Eastern signs on it. And that was painted by John. And it's these. They're still there. So we're told in mainstream history that the Beatles suddenly picked up on the occult, and we keep getting shown on websites, oh, the Beatles got into the occult. Here's Sgt. Pepper album from 1967. This is 7 or 8 years before, when they were still kids, wet behind the ears, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old. And they're doing stuff like this. There you go, there's another one. So that's the Beatles back then. pre-Beatles, messing about with symbols. And this is from the book All These Years, Tune In, Mark Lewison. My contention is that it wasn't the middle classes in London that gave them these ideas. They may have helped them to make them more sophisticated. They may have helped them to broaden their horizons. But I think, and I don't think it was even subconscious, as Thomas Sheridan has suggested, I'm saying that these guys were clued up to some extent pretty much before they went to London and became famous. This is Ringo. All These Years, Tune In, from Mark Lewison's book of 2013, The Beatles Historian, who's always credited as the Beatles historian, and his work is good. He's a very good researcher. Okay, he's mainstream, but he gets the stuff out there, and this is just one of them. This is like, wow. He says, this is about Ringo's grandmother. For her part, Annie was something of a 20th century witch, invoking the name of the devil and concocting her own remedies and potions when tending the sick. Not for nothing, and never without love, would Richard, who later became Ringo, come to describe Granny as the voodoo queen of Liverpool. Okay, so we've gone through this. We're sort of wrapping up for time now, so there you go, Beatles. That's Robert Richard Hieronymus, who I interviewed a few years ago. He's a veteran symbologist, one of the first guys to really get into this stuff. He worked for Elektra Records in the late 60s, worked for Jimi Hendrix and made record covers and what have you. You can find the interview on my webpage. You can't really read that. He's basically just talking about the Beatle in Egypt and how sacred it was, and he's suggesting that it's a symbol for birth and recreation, as in recreation, creation and recreation, and he thinks that the Beatles perhaps subconsciously picked up on that when they were looking at the name Beatles. The official story is that the Beatles went for the name Beatles, spelt with two E's, because they were inspired by Buddy Holly and the Crickets. So they saw the word crickets and they thought, we like Buddy Holly. Not so crazy on crickets, but, insects, like that, that's good. Okay, we'll go with Beatles. Because when you say Beatles, it could be beat. So it could be beat music or Beatles as in an insect, as in Buddy Holly. So it's kind of playing with that's the roundabout, that's what all of them have said over the years. That's the roundabout kind of thing, with a few little bits and pieces sometimes mixed up and go in different directions. But that was the early Beatles. But of course, in 1960, they changed the spelling to beat, as in B-E-A-T from B-E-E. But so they didn't want to be, you would have thought, okay, so we don't want to be Beatles anymore. But there you go, there's an early 1963. So this is like a year into their national recording career, and they're still using the insect. So was there more to that? There is Ringo behind. That's February 63. Yeah, the date is on the top there. February 17th, 1963. So I'm just skimming past that one. I think Mark's mentioned that already. We had a Beatle who then became a winged Beatle. And very finally, I'm going to mention this one. This is on my website as well. If you look, it's John Lennon and Ringo Starr, of course. This photograph is notable among the mainstream thinking for being the last photograph of John and Ringo together, the last one taken of them. It was in 1979. That is, when I saw that a few months ago, I thought, bloody hell, how come no one's ever put this up on a website? Bloody hell, look, he's got the thing, the pyramid, the eye, the dollar sign, the whole bloody thing. How come no... We've seen pictures of Madonna wearing it. We've seen pictures of this person, that person. But we're talking about John Lennon here, the guy who practically invented pop music, and as we know it. And no one's ever picked up on this, and I don't know why. That's 1979. There's another picture of him, which I've got on my website, from 1980s. We're talking shortly before he died, where he's still wearing that. So I'm going to wrap up by saying what was going on here. Was John Lennon, by doing this, being like an early version of a Madonna or a Rihanna, or as we get these days, where you get pop stars shoving the symbols like that in your face? You watch videos, these sort of things are coming at you all the time. This is a private photograph though, but is John Lennon, there's so many ways you could go. Is he telling us that he's part of that system and that he's laughing at us? Is he saying, yeah, I'm like Madonna where she's doing it with her jacket on the Into the Groove video. This is me saying the same thing. I am their puppet, and this is my branding. Or is he saying, or is it because he's into ancient Egypt? Because he was. There he is. He's in Egypt there. Yoko was a collector and is a collector of ancient Egyptian artifacts. for their profit-making powers, and also for their powers of magic, their mystical powers. And that's what she said a few days before John died in an interview. That's them in Egypt, where she went to get some more of these artifacts. So is it because he's into ancient Egypt, or is it because he's telling us that actually he's on our side? And he's a prototype truther. Think about it, because even as far back as 1966, I've got a quote here. So we think about John Lennon and him rebelling against the system and going against the man, the establishment, when he was with Yoko and the Bed-Ins and all that stuff in the late 60s as the Beatles were coming to a close. But in 1966, when he was still a lovable mop-top, he said, the trouble with government as it is that it doesn't represent the people. It controls them. All they seem to want to do, the people who run the country, is keep themselves in power and stop us knowing what's going on. I'm not saying politicians are all terrible men. It's just the system of government that I don't like. It'll be hard to change. And of course, in 68, he said, I think all our society is run by insane people for insane objectives. I think we're being run by maniacs for maniacal ends. I think they're all insane. And of course, we also had that LSD comment earlier on. And I'm going to close with this. If John Lennon was a prototype truther, he financed and was a friend of Mae Brussell. Mae Brussell was one of the first alternative researchers. She began straight after the JFK assassinations. She began to look into the conspiracies of that. And if you look on YouTube, you will find loads of her radio shows where she gets into the Manson killings, also John's killing, ironically, because they turned out to be friends. They became friends, and John actually financed her. Robin Blackwell, a former editor of Red Mole, a short-lived British so-called revolutionary newspaper of the early 70s, said John, in the late 60s, early 70s, was setting up a project with a not very well assorted group of people who were heading into alternative technology, alternative media, alternative politics, and alternative lifestyles. So when John came out of his retirement, his so-called retirement in 1980 to begin his music career, and was set to go on strike for workers the day after he was shot. He was booked to go to a strike a day or two after that. He was set for that. So when he came out of retirement, was he just coming out to play music, or was he coming out to relive, in the Reagan era, his revolutionary zeal? Well, we'll never know. But that's it from me. I will just say that of course, in part 2, Mark will be talking about another dead Beatle, and we're not talking about John or George, of course. So that's my site. Please go take a look. There you go. It's the Occult Beatles. Very easy. I mean, if you type in the Occult Beatles, you don't have to do all this HTTPS jazz. You should be able to find it very, very easily. And there's also this one, Conspiromedia, which is a work in progress at the moment. I'm completely redoing that one because I'm going to be looking into the work, inspired by the work of David McGowan, who did the Laurel Canyon stuff. I have been for the last couple of years, and this site is going to be the base for all that research. So please do go take a look, and if nothing's going on, come back, because there will be stuff on there. Inspired by the work of Dave McGowan, I have been looking to see if the same thing was going on in London. And from the 2 years or so that I've been doing the research, yes. I mean, I mentioned one of them today, Steve Abrams, with his Human Ecology Fund and what have you. So there you go. That's me in a nutshell for tonight. Thank you to Mark for having me. Thank you guys for not falling asleep or walking off. And it's my first ever public talk. I've been a DJ all my life. I've played in front of 2,000-3,000 people. I've been on the radio. I still am. I still present a radio show. But for some reason, this is like, wow, I'm nervous. But so thank you for sticking with me tonight. And thank you.
So we're getting into one of the most enduring conspiracy theories within the music industry, the idea that the real Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced by an impostor that's been playing the public role to this day. That, of course, sounds preposterous to people the first time they hear it, but bear with me as we look at some photographic evidence and some symbolism and some other documentary stuff to try and make sense of this whole thing. So the idea is that the original James Paul McCartney died in a car crash in 1966. There's many different versions of the story. The most popular one involves him getting into some sort of argument with Brian Epstein and the other Beatles in a recording session on the 11th of September 1966, 9/11/66, which is the date that crops up time and time again in this particular legend. In some tellings of the story, the date is the 9th of November 66, which is 9/11/66 in the British date format. So it tends to vary as to whether you're speaking to an American or a Brit as to which date they tend to prefer. But 9/11/66 just keeps on cropping up. Here's Nick Collestrom's book, which is titled, in no uncertain terms, The Life and Death of Paul McCartney, 1942 to 1966. There it is. Just before we examine some accounts of this story, here's an interesting newspaper cutting which was brought to my attention a while back. It seems to date from 1963 because it refers to James Paul McCartney, aged 21, which he would have been in 1963, musician, which they've misspelt, of 24 Lynn Road, Allerton, Liverpool, was fined £25 and disqualified from driving for 12 months at Wallasey today after he admitted exceeding the speed limit along Seabank Road. This seems to be a precursor to the whole idea of McCartney dying in a car crash. In the conventional version of the conspiracy theory, it's a white convertible sports car that he speeds off in. And he gets involved in an accident. He's near decapitated, according to the official versions of the story. But here we have this story in 1963. A curious thing is the fact that the newspaper is reporting him as James Paul McCartney, a 21-year-old musician, whereas by 1963, the Beatles had already become household names in Britain. So everyone reading this newspaper would know who Paul McCartney is. So it's an interesting way of reporting that story. This picture purports to be from a moped accident which Paul is said to have had on Boxing Day 1965 on the Wirral up there close to Liverpool. And he was supposed to have been with Tara Brown, who was this young heir to the Guinness brewing empire, who himself died in a car crash in December 1966 in a white convertible sports car. He was evidently speeding through the London streets, lost control of his car and died at the age of 21. The story of Tara Brown is immortalised in the Beatles song A Day in the Life from the Sgt. Pepper album, where they talk about, I saw the news today, oh boy, what is it, he didn't notice that the lights had changed. He blew his mind out in a car, exactly. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. So this is an account of the Tara Brown incident in the Beatles song. And it's interesting that when we get the theory of what happened to McCartney, it seems to echo what we got with Tara Brown. But the McCartney incident is supposed to have occurred earlier. Anyway, these are facial injuries that are said to have been incurred by Paul in the moped accident of 1965, which again seems to be a kind of precursor to what was going to be coming the following year with this idea that he'd been killed in a car crash in 1966. The reason I've stuck a radio in here is just to remind me to talk about a couple of radio bulletins. I have to put these visual reminders in, otherwise I forget. I got contacted by a very well-known British music producer last year. I'm not going to give this individual's name because I told him I wouldn't, and I don't choose to divulge who this person was. But this person told me that they can vividly remember in 1966 hearing a news bulletin come over the radio stating that Paul McCartney had been involved in a car accident. And they said they listened avidly for a repeat of that news bulletin, and it never came. It was just the one lone reporting of that story. It puts me in mind very much of the coverage of Building 7 on 9/11, right, by Jane Stanley of the BBC, where they reported that Building 7 had already collapsed some 20 odd minutes before it did, and you never saw that bulletin again on TV, and the BBC claimed to have lost it from their archives, but fortunately recordings exist. I was also contacted by a woman in America who also told me that she can remember in 1966 in the US hearing a radio bulletin stating that Paul McCartney of the Beatles had been killed in a road accident. So this one went further by saying that he'd actually died. Now, we've only got these two people's accounts of these events, so we can make of it what we will. I don't consider that they have any reason for lying, particularly the producer that got in contact with me, but there's a couple of accounts that people claim they remember from first-hand memory relating back to 1966. The Sgt. Pepper sleeve, which we looked at briefly earlier, is supposed to be absolutely laden with clues pertaining to the replacement of McCartney. Possibly the most obvious one is the fact that the Beatles are gathered around a graveside, with the flowers here on a freshly dug grave. And you've got the original incarnation of the Beatles over here, looking all drab and grey and sad and forlorn. And then in the centre, you've got the bright, vibrant new Beatles ready to enter into this new phase in 1967. And the idea is that the McCartney you get in the new lineup of the Beatles is different to the earlier McCartney. Most notably, he's taller than the other Beatles, which never used to be the case in the original lineup of the group. Now, someone worked out that if you apply a mirror to the centre of the drum, where you get the name of the band, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, if you put a mirror in the dead centre, so you create a mirror image halfway up the picture there, you get a very interesting effect. In the middle, you can see that it now says I1IX, he die. And if you ascribe numerical values to those figures, it becomes 911, he die. And the he die bit occurs directly below where McCartney is standing in this picture. So according to many researchers, this is another symbolic clue that what we're looking at is a replacement to the original Paul. Another album that's said to be replete with clues is Abbey Road, that came out in 1969. And here we have the four Beatles walking across a zebra crossing. So it's black and white duality again. And Paul is out of step with the other Beatles. He's got his other leg forward. He's also barefoot and he's in a loosely fitting suit. And this has been interpreted as Paul representing a corpse. And this whole affair is supposed to be a funeral procession. So you've got John in white representing the priest. You've got Ringo as a mourner or a pallbearer dressed in black. And then George in denim as the gravedigger, with Paul as the corpse in this particular funeral procession, according to the interpretation that's been put on that image. There was a very great resurgence in the idea of McCartney having died and been replaced in the United States towards the end of 1969, around the time that the Abbey Road album was released. And it came largely through the student community of the US, different university and college campuses. Very famously, there was a call into a radio show hosted by a DJ called Russ Gibb, where students phoned up and they said, the Beatles have been giving us clues in their music pertaining to McCartney having died and been replaced. This radio broadcast took place on the 12th of October 1969, which just happened to be the birth date of Aleister Crowley, coincidentally. And during this radio show, students were saying, you should take a copy of the White Album from the Beatles and play the track Revolution Number 9 backwards. And at the intro, where you've got a studio announcer saying the words number 9, number 9, number 9, when you reverse it, it comes out as turn me on dead man, turn me on dead man. And this is supposed to be the first of the Beatles clues relating to this replacement. We're getting on now to the Red and the Blue Beatles albums, which Matt mentioned. And red and blue within Freemasonry represents different lodges within the Scottish and York rites of Freemasonry. You have the red lodges and the blue lodges. And with these two albums, you had, first of all, the Red album for the early period of the Beatles, and then the Blue album. But what seems to have taken place here, if you study the pictures very closely, is we've got a different Paul. There he is, second in from the left in this particular picture. And when you compare them side by side, it looks very much like a different person. Now, a good friend of mine mentioned to me a while back that when she was very young, she was a very small kid, she walked past a record shop window where they were displaying copies of the Red and the Blue albums. And she looked at the two of them. She was probably about 7 or 8 years old. And she said to herself, oh, they switched one of the members. So at that age, she recognised that this was a different guy as she saw it, which I thought was very interesting because kids often seem to pick up on things that grown-ups can miss. Anyway, moving on, there's plenty more of it. What happened to the real Paul? So this is Paul stepping out with Jane Asher, who I mentioned in the first part, his girlfriend in the 60s, the daughter of Dr. Richard Asher. They're more or less the same height. Paul's slightly taller there. But then we fast forward to 1968, I believe this was, and here's Paul stepping out with Jane once again, and he seems to have sprouted up a few inches. It's either that or he's wearing Cuban heels, but he doesn't seem to be in this particular picture. So there's some height discrepancies there straight away, which is one of the things that researchers notice the most between what they perceive to be two different Pauls. That's Peter Asher, who I mentioned in the first part. Like I said, Ed Sheeran crossed with Austin Powers, right? Jane Asher's brother. Here's Margaret Elliott. This is Jane Asher's mother, who I mentioned in the first part, the music teacher, wife of Dr. Richard. There's Dr. Asher again. We've already covered those. Now, do I go into this? Yeah, let's do it really quickly. This is from Paul McCartney's most recent video for a song called Who Cares from the Egypt Station album. In the video, you see McCartney playing the role of what appears to be some sort of doctor or psychiatrist, psychologist. On his door frame to his office, he's got the sign Dr. Lorenz, behavioural hypnotist and meteorologist. This would appear to be a direct reference to the author of this work, The Essence of Chaos, Edward Lorenz. We've got a nice monarch butterfly on there for the mind control overtones. And this was the guy who put forward the theory that the slightest change to the equilibrium of a situation, such as a butterfly flapping its wings, can cause a tornado in another part of the world because of the knock-on effect and the way that everything is connected. This was the theory that he advanced. So in the video to the song, we appear to have McCartney playing the role of Dr. Lorenz. And he has this young girl coming in to visit him in his office, and he appears to be helping her deal with bullying, so the story goes. But what you actually find in the video is non-stop symbolism pertaining to mind control programming. So could this be going back to the work of Dr. Asher once again in the 1960s when the original James Paul McCartney was living in his medical practice? But through the video, you see all these depictions of trauma-based mind control. Look at vigilantcitizen.com. That website is a great resource to break down what all this symbolism means. It's all to do with mind control programming and trauma and satanic ritual abuse. And it's right here in this McCartney video. Has anyone seen the movie Yesterday yet? No? Well done. Good move. I saw it for research. It's a Richard Curtis feel-good movie, but his films always make me feel bloody terrible myself. Can't stand Richard Curtis movies, but I did go and see this for research purposes, directed by Danny Boyle. And it's very interesting because what you've got is the central character is a musician, and it doesn't explain why this happens, but he gets hit by a bus during this worldwide blackout. And when he comes to, he discovers he's living in a world where nobody else remembers the music of the Beatles, except him. So he's a struggling musician, and he starts performing Lennon and McCartney songs, and everyone around him is saying, "That's amazing. When did you write that song?" And he realizes that he can pass himself off as this brilliant songwriter by performing all the Beatles songs, and nobody knows that they're not his. So we've got elements of plagiarism here, and we've got elements of a charlatan, an impostor, passing himself off as somebody that he's not. And the whole film is hinged around the song Yesterday, which is, of course, Paul McCartney's most famous composition. So you've got to wonder whether there's some sly clues being offered in the narrative of this movie, particularly as it's a who's who of the British establishment in terms of the people involved in it. You know, Danny Boyle, Richard Curtis, who's married to Emma Freud, who's the daughter of Sir Clement Freud, who was exposed as a paedophile, only after he died, mind, because there's no living paedophiles. And you've got Ed Sheeran in it, and he's, what is he, an MBE? You've got James Corden in it, he's an MBE. So it's like, proper establishment furniture here. A few other little clues that have been dropped through the years. This one comes from the Beatles press conference in LA in 1966, right at the tail end of their touring career. They stopped doing live gigs and just went into the studio from this point on. But during this press conference, John makes the comment, sometimes you can't tell the would-bes from the real thing. There's also a little video snippet that I usually play, but I don't have it in this presentation. And it's a performance of the song Yesterday on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1965. So Paul performs Yesterday solo, and then he finishes the song. John comes back on the mic and he says, "Thank you, Paul. That was just like him." And as we've said, John was ever the joker, the clown, but could there be more to that comment than just some mere throwaway thing? Here's Paul on a TV interview flashing up a very familiar sign. So we're doing the very quick version of this. Right, the candidate that gets put forward more than any other for having replaced the original McCartney is an individual by the name of William Shepherd, nicknamed Billy Shears. And so the idea is that on the Sgt. Pepper album, when you've got the song at the start of the album saying, "May I introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears," it's introducing the public to the individual that is now playing the public role of Paul. This book came out in 2009, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. It was actually released on the 9th of the 9th, 999, or 666 if you flip it upside down. It had 66 chapters, over 666 pages. And it was credited to an author or an encoder by the name of Thomas U. Harriot. The book purported to be the memoirs of this guy, William Shepherd, who says that he's descended from William Wallace, who is the character played by Mel Gibson in the movie Braveheart. He comes from a Scottish Freemasonic family, and that he was bred for this role, basically. He was trained as a musician, and it became clear some way along the line that he was going to step in and take up the public role of Paul McCartney. So this book purports to be him spilling the beans and explaining how the whole thing was done. Now, it's presented as historical fiction, and it has to be done that way because otherwise this guy, Thomas U. Harriot, would be up to his neck in lawsuits because of all the legal implications of the things that he's saying. So he will state that the book is historical fiction, and he says that there are some fictional embellishments in the narrative. So there's plausible deniability there. So if ever he was challenged on any one individual point, he could say, well, I told you there were fictional embellishments. But when you read what the writer of this book has to say, it displays a lot of inside knowledge of the Beatles camp and of Beatles associations, which, to my mind, can only have come from somebody that moved within those circles. It's either that or they have a very vivid imagination. There was an update to this book that came out last year called the 9 after 909 edition, released on the 9th of the 9th, 18. 1 + 8 = 9. And this one was blue. So you have the red version of the book and the blue version of the book, and it updates the story. These are all the clues. I normally play a few videos here. We don't have time anyway. But there are many, many video snippets of the individual we think of today as Paul McCartney, making references to, or references being made to him as Billy or William. So many people, when he walks into a room, are saying, "Hello, William. Hello, Billy." There's a great montage of these. Look at the work of Mike Williams, aka Sage of Quay. If you go onto his YouTube channel, just type in Sage of Quay or his Paul is Dead channel, he's got a whole wealth of video evidence suggesting that the individual passing himself off as Paul McCartney today is actually named William or Billy. It certainly takes some explaining away when you have so many instances of this taking place. Now, Mike is of the view that what you often get in interviews with McCartney is an element of masterful speaking, which is another tenet of Freemasonry. And this is where they say one thing, but if you can read between the lines, they're telling you something else beneath the surface narrative. So again, there's plausible deniability. And if they were ever challenged on it, they would say, well, of course, I was saying this. But if you know how to study their speech and to read symbolism, you can see that they're saying two very different things. So in this one example, McCartney's picking up this award, and he says, "I see this as a huge honour for me and my family, and I think of how proud my Liverpool mum and dad would have been to see this," which is a very strange thing to say. Wouldn't you just say, "my mum and dad"? So it's as if he's telling you he's not really that guy. And there's other examples as well, but let's just forward into this section. Many McCartneys. So this is where, if you present any one of these photos in isolation to the average person in the street and you say, "Who is this?" they're going to say, "Well, it's Paul McCartney, of course." But it's not until you place many of them side by side that you see the many discrepancies and anomalies, and you start to wonder whether it can really be the same person. So let's take a look at these. This is a montage that Mike Williams put together of the different McCartneys from over the years. Now, the first one is who we think of as the biological James Paul McCartney. But then when you look at some of the other characters in this motley assortment, you can see quite a few discrepancies. Number 5 looks more like Sylvester Stallone to me. And I've no idea who number 8 is. But to my eyes, what we appear to have here is at least 2 individuals, probably more, but they are not all the same man. The last time I checked my eyes, they were working okay.
The eyebrows, mate.
Yeah, the eyebrows is a big clue, because the original McCartney had a very distinctive arched right eyebrow.
Yeah, it's the eyebrows, they didn't change.
And his dad, it didn't change, all right, okay. And his dad had the eyebrow as well. So here's another selection. The first one is supposed to be the original Paul, and then we have all the different ones. The second one is a photo taken by Astrid Kircher back in the Hamburg days, if I'm not mistaken. Now, they appear to have been playing games with us over the years, because in certain McCartney videos, there are hints at there being more than one Paul. This is the video to the song Wonderful Christmas Time. And at first, you think that you're looking at McCartney and a mirror image of himself. But when you study the noses, you can see that they look very different. And what we appear to have is 2 separate individuals and not a mirror image of the same guy. In the video to his song Coming Up, you've got him playing many different roles. He's always seemed to enjoy dressing up and donning disguises, whether we accept that it's the original Paul or it's different Pauls. He does seem to enjoy dressing up. In the Pipes of Peace video, he played the part of both a British and a German soldier in World War I. And in the Spies Like Us video from 1985, you see him in disguise with a Prince Charles mask, and then he rips off the face mask to reveal that it's McCartney underneath. So he seems to enjoy playing these games. Now, this is one that I put together because I think it really does make the point. The first photo is from September 68 from the video to Hey Jude. Then the second one is from the rooftop concert that was featured in the Let It Be movie of January 69. So it's 4 months later. And that's supposed to be the same guy, right? So first of all, the eyes have changed colour. And also, I would ask whether it's possible to grow a beard in those advanced stages in just 4 months. Those are genuine dates for these photos. People argue with me all day long over this, but to my mind, that has to be 2 different individuals. But you see what's happened here is this can't be a case of the original Paul having died in 66 and been replaced, because the first one is from 1968. And then in 1969, we appear to have a different one. So what we appear to have is a scenario where there have been at least 2 and possibly more than 2 McCartneys since 1968, 66. Nobody said this was easy. Nobody said this was a simple subject area to study. Now this is frozen. Is that an omen? No. Yeah, somebody sent me a batch of original Beatles books and magazines from the 1960s for me to study. And I hoped that if I looked at original photos that can't have been doctored, so this is pre-internet, no Photoshop would have taken place, I could compare the photos from these magazines and get to the bottom of it once and for all. How naive was I? All I found in looking at these magazines is more of the same. I saw what appears to be different individuals going back to the 1960s. I don't think that's the same person myself. Again, people will argue with me all day long, but what we appear to have is different individuals. Can that really be the same man? Accounting for shadows, accounting for aging, I don't see it. Here's a montage that I've put together. The first one is early Hamburg era Paul, possibly the original Paul. But the one on the top right is the individual that most people think of as biological Paul. Most people will say that's the real Paul McCartney. But the problem is that the first picture comes from before that era, and the first picture, to my mind, looks very much like the present day Paul, right? The guy that we have now, that, to my thinking, is a younger version of that guy. So we have an interesting scenario where the second guy on the top, who most people think of as the real Paul, could actually be the replacement. This could be the one that was inserted into the story for a certain period, and everyone got used to him and thought, oh, that's the real Paul, but actually he wasn't. And then he went away again after a while. You know, it's a total mindfuck. Here's Paul back to back with Ringo. There's some height discrepancies going on there again. They are, of course, several decades apart. Ringo seems to have shrunk in recent years, which doesn't make things easy. This is one of the Beatles magazine excerpts from the 1960s, and it's the biographies of the four, and it gives their heights. And the heights of John, Paul and George are all listed as 5'11", according to this article. They're all the same height, and Ringo is shorter at 5'8", and yet we don't see that in photographs. There's one theory that what we've been looking at all these years is twins, fraternal twins, that Paul was one of twins, and we were never told. And what we've had all these years is one or the other of the twins stepping into the public role. So there's a researcher by the name of Miles Mathis who's forwarded this theory, and other researchers have picked up on it as well. He states that what we have here is the original twin boys, even though one's taller than the other. Not sure I go for that one. And this theory goes that Mike McGear, it's his stage name, Mike McCartney, said to be Paul's brother, is an actor, because he looks nothing like him. After all, most people can agree on this. So according to Mathis and others, Mike McGear was hired as an actor to throw people off the scent, that what we're really looking at is twins. But then the other theory that we have to consider is that the real Paul has always been around and never actually went anywhere. And that for whatever reason, the conspiracy theory that Paul died in a car crash in 1966 was a fabrication, or it was symbolic and ritualistic in some way. It was designed to achieve some sort of mind-controlling agenda. But the original Paul's always been around. According to the researcher who sent me these pictures, what we're looking at is the same Paul decades apart. So this person claims it's the same guy. So, you know, the original guy never went away, according to this theory. Different decades, same guy. And here, on two chat shows, decades apart, he's adopting the same kind of posture. And then, as I just mentioned, the idea that the real Paul, the one that we think of as the real Paul, may be the actual imposter. This guy seems to be one that appeared for a certain period, but has not been there the whole time. He cropped up in 1966 in the series of press interviews that the Beatles were doing. Don't know who this one is. LSD era. So I usually do a show of hands when I do this talk, and I ask if anyone can accept that this can possibly be two photographs of the same guy. Is there anyone here that accepts this can possibly be the same guy? What are we saying? Okay, so we're agreed that this cannot possibly be two photos of the same person, right? Okay, so straight away we have an issue, because both of these people have been presented to us as Paul McCartney, and they can't be the same guy. Whether we're talking about a straight replacement, whether we're talking about one guy stepping in and out through the years, and the original one never going away, whatever the circumstances, we have more than one Paul McCartney. And this alone is evidence of mind control fuckeries, and it's evidence of deception. And to my mind, this could only have been achieved with the full complicity of military intelligence. going right to the very upper levels of the British establishment when you consider that Paul McCartney has been knighted by the Queen. It's impossible that this replacement could have been slipped under the net without the knowledge of these kinds of authorities. So this implies that it's been done with the full complicity. And this does tend to reinforce the idea that the Beatles were very intimately connected with British military intelligence, who would have worked to have covered this whole thing up. Whatever the motives, whatever the reason for doing it, it's clear that complicity has taken place here. John Halliday, we ain't got time for him. So, a recent magazine article featuring McCartney where he says, "I was one of the Beatles. Can you believe it?" Well, can you? And so, bringing this whole presentation full circle, I started with the question, were the Beatles really four regular working class lads from Liverpool who just happened to write a few catchy songs, put a band together, and against all the odds, just happened to make it big and become the most influential band of all time? I hope that tonight's presentation has answered that question in your minds, and I hope that you'll take away these thoughts with you. That's pretty much all I have to present to you this evening. Got out of here by 10:15. Thanks again to Matt for his contributions. Do check out his blogs. Thanks to Dan for organising. Thanks to everyone for turning out. See you again soon.